Class, MASH. By Anutty. Chapter 261, Stop. Stop. The word was spoken normally, but MASH froze. It echoed within the room. It sounded like it was bouncing off the walls. His fist was inches from the ground, but he was frozen. He could barely even breathe, although some sweat had started to build on his palms. The single word had come from the general, and it had trapped everyone in place. It was a command, uttered by one who had the right to do it. The air itself seemed to freeze at her voice. I am known as the castle keeper. Do you really think I would let you damage my castle? This time her voice had returned to its usual jovialness, but he still felt like there was an edge to it. It was only something that someone who was completely self-assured in their ability could say. MASH was annoyed with being sealed or trapped. He tried resisting the control but just couldn't manage to move. However, even if his body was locked in place, his magic wasn't. MASH let it flare out. Lightning started dancing at the edge of his skin, but MASH halted as he felt a familiar chill air enter the room. I thought you wouldn't be doing that. Arthur's own words seemed to clash with the general. It broke her control, but his casual tone stopped MASH from doing anything hasty. His domain let him get a good grasp of the situation, and he simply bent down and picked up the chair. He had already been hunched over. He was less than a second away from destroying the ground. Amazingly, it wasn't broken. The chair didn't seem like it could have withstood the impact. Jill was in the process of standing after her failed teleport, and Luke was moving toward the door. Normally, they had such great coordination, but now they were completely caught off guard. All but Red, who remained seated. She met the general's eyes, but the older woman was looking toward Arthur now. The Cold King's domain? When did you get that? Earlier today. His brother's two-word response seemed inappropriate for the situation. He just answered the general like nothing was wrong. The general too had revealed private information casually. Also, what was the Cold King's domain? His brother had talked about his skills before. He said that he got the skill today, but how? MASH knew for certain that his brother didn't have a way to steal skills like MASH or Luke. Luke's skill was more like borrowing than stealing though. Once everyone had retaken their seats, the general continued, although she was more focused on Red now. It is a passive skill, an aura or presence skill that is amplified by our location. It was an explanation of a poor one. She could have told them ahead of time, but he guessed that they wouldn't have noticed if not for Red. There probably weren't many people who could recognize it, so the general probably never needed to mention it. The display of power that had passed between the general and his brother was rather odd. Arthur wasn't much higher leveled than MASH, but MASH hadn't been able to do anything against the skill. How? And where did his brother get a new skill? Those were questions for later. We have no intention of joining. The only thing we plan on doing is going back north and killing some more monsters. Red spoke as a matter of fact and wasn't exactly being polite anymore. MASH noticed the shift in her tone but said nothing. He was annoyed at people who used their skills so casually. Even if he could respect the general, it didn't mean that he did at the moment. He agreed with Red, and just leaned back into his chair. The general was quick with her response. Even if the war happened, it would be several weeks or maybe even months from now. I'm merely telling you now so that you can be prepared. I expect you will get involved whether you want to or not. Her gaze drifted toward MASH as she spoke. He frowned at her but couldn't disagree with her. None of them even tried to protest it. With how their lives have been going, he expected to be right at the center of the battle. The general probably had the same information as the king and knew that they would get involved somehow. MASH wasn't sure how to respond to her stare, but he didn't need to either. Luke was surprisingly the one to speak up. He confronted the general directly, not bothering to talk about his real meaning. If you believe that, then why are we here? As Arthur had mentioned, I wanted you to join the fight formally rather than showing up randomly amidst all of the chaos. MASH had just been listening, but that didn't feel fair. They would be far in the north and completely separated from the conflict. It wasn't like he wanted to get involved. If anything, he was trying his best to not get further invested, and he said as much. We were being honest before. We won't be anywhere near the fighting unless my brother needs our help. The general leaned back to sit straight in her chair. She looked at him and the group as a whole and laughed. It was a mocking fake chuckle that could only be insulting. Do you even realize what your track record has been? The orphanage, the demon invasion, hundreds of refugees from a dungeon, uncovering those spies, and I would bet you were somehow involved with the sudden influx of dungeons. You and your group have been involved in every major headache in the past few months. Any one of those things happening in a year would already be unusual. Did I miss anything? How many more surprises do I need to prepare for? Mash fell silent at that. When she laid out the events that she knew of like that, he realized just how many things they had been involved in. Even if they weren't to blame for any of those situations, he had escalated nearly all of them to violence. It also made him realize that she didn't actually know everything. The stuff in Kral and probably Gerald too. She didn't know of the things he had done within the dungeons as well. He felt a little relieved to know that she didn't know everything. Mash coughed awkwardly to clear his throat but didn't know how else to respond. The general was eyeing him more carefully now, and he realized that he must have given away his thoughts on his face. So, what do you want from us? The general turned back to Red. The question drew her attention and she started rubbing her chin with one of her gauntlet hands. After a second of thought, she responded. Well, I don't know how to deal with you for. Capturing or killing you would be extreme, and several important people would be on my ass. Recruiting you was the simplest solution, but that probably wouldn't have worked. The king still doesn't want you lingering in the city for too long, but I think that ship has sailed. No, I think I will settle for monitoring your location. One of the general's gauntlet hands entered into a small storage space that opened up beside her. Mash could peek into it with his domain, and he realized it was a lot bigger than the opening would let on. That probably meant that she could adjust where the door opened to as well. She moved her hand like she was digging through items. She spoke casually all the while, even nonchalantly mentioning that she had considered him. Mash was glad that he had friends, actually, it was family, in high places. The general wasn't done just yet, and pulled out a pair of bracelets, and proceeded to toss them to Luke and Jill. Sorry, but the two of you are going to be carrying them. I don't think they would be able to withstand the other's skills. Mash nodded slowly but stopped when he realized what she had just admitted. He couldn't contain his excitement. He didn't know that there was a way to peek into people's skills or class. Could he do it? Was there a monster he could eat that would let him? You do have a way to see our skills. Mash exclaimed. He probably shouldn't have, but it had just come out. Even though he had expected it, the confirmation was still surprising. Did you really just figure that out? That came from Jill, and Mash turned to glare at her. Although, his gaze drifted to her wrist as she put the bracelet on. It just looked like a simple silver accessory, with no special frills or gems. It seemed almost like a shackle but was too thin to be one. Mash felt traces of mana engraved into the metal, but it was hidden with the metal. The armor on her other wrist was much more like a shackle. She had put that on without much protest. Any protest really? In his domain, he saw Luke doing the same and turned to look at him. Luke noticed and spoke. Seems fine. It's just a bracelet. Plus, we do cause a lot of trouble. Mash just stared at them in disbelief. How could they just put that on? What if it lets her control them? They were definitely more skeptical than that normally. It must be that skill again, and he wanted to say as much. Arthur seemed to know what Mash was going to say. It does exactly what she said. I have a few of them on me as well. Mash looked at his brother, although the gesture was unnecessary. He could see Arthur with his domain and already knew that his brother trusted the general. His brother's confirmation told him everything that he needed, and Mash settled back into his seat. He had been leaning forward as the conversation progressed. Well, as riveting as it is to hear you bicker, I am going to need you to leave. Although, I'm sure we will meet again soon enough. The way the general said that was ominous. It was definitely intentional too. He didn't need any fancy tricks to know that. The grin she was wearing told him that she knew exactly what she was doing. Mash's opinion of the general had not dropped over their encounter. She was rude, boastful, and arrogant. However, it felt like she was allowed to be those things. The whole interaction infuriated him, but there was something about the woman's directness that he respected. So many chose to hide things, but she shared almost everything when asked. Mash stood without saying any formal farewells. The others replied politely, but he just waltzed right out of the room. He might receive a lecture from Arthur about it later, but he was surprisingly tired. He had used inhuman hibernation earlier and it had dealt with his fatigue and stress, but he still felt like it had been a long day. Meeting with a god and making a sculpture for them wound up being one of the smallest events of the day. He almost couldn't believe that it had all happened in a single day, and he had lived it. Chapter 262, Restful Nights. Mash flopped into bed face first. The bed groaned loudly. He was getting too heavy for the bed, but he actually found it more comfortable now. His body sunk into the mattress, and the pillows bent around his head. They trapped his head in place and covered his ears too. Somehow, the night had made him even more tired as his sister berated him with her concern. She had healed him 3 times. His healing was perfect with his skills, but hers had gone a step further. His skin glowed, and his hair felt like it was sparkling. Despite all of that, he just wanted to sleep. The questions from his sister had been bad, but his brother had returned at some point and started lecturing him. That went on for who knew how long. Finally, he was given the reprieve he needed. His face was pressed against the pillows, and they bent as he turned over in the bed. His gaze shot to the roof, and he just stared at it for a moment. His ceiling didn't have anything special on it. Normally, the ceiling only comprised of a plain white paint. It was dark though and he couldn't actually see anything at the moment. Well, he could see what his domain let him see, and that let him notice the subtle difference. Something had dripped from the ceiling, and he noticed the drop of a liquid fall to the ground. At first, Mash thought it was just a bug, but it splattered on the ground, and he let out a very audible sigh. No one was around, and he just wanted to ignore it. He just turned back around and let his face dig into the pillow. He tried to ignore the dripping noise but failed quickly. Still desiring sleep, he forced himself up on his hands. At the very least, he should check what it was. He couldn't see it through and needed to start the lights. His room had light crystals in it, and the enchantment to operate them was near the door. His hands sunk into the bed as he rolled off the bed. It felt like it was trying to draw him in, and he fell to the ground as he slid down the side. His legs struck the floor first, and then he let the rest of his body fall down. He stayed on the ground for a moment, before rising to his feet. It took more effort than he was willing to give, but he pushed himself over to the enchantment. The lights flared to life and the room became visible to his naked eyes. It had been a while since he last used the lights here. He had been relying on his domain for a while and hadn't bothered using the lights before. He had only used the lights once before, back when he had first arrived here. Otherwise, the sun was usually good enough during the day, and even the moon could light up the room. It was just a cloudy day today, and the light of the moon didn't reach his windows. Mash didn't look up just yet and just blinked his eyes a few times to adjust to the sudden light. One more sigh escaped his lips, and he turned up toward the ceiling. He already had a small idea of what to expect, as the red liquid continued to drop to the ground. It didn't smell like blood, so he assumed it was just normal paint. On the ceiling, he saw a large circle painted there. The circle was filled with an intricate pattern that reminded him vaguely of enchantments. At the center was a circle that was perfectly parted into 4 parts by diagonal lines. It wasn't completely the same as enchantments though, and Mash frowned as he looked up at it. He thought that he had seen something like it before, but he just couldn't place it. He didn't feel anything with his domain, so it wasn't magical. Or it didn't have any mana in it at the moment. Mash considered testing it. He could make a simple enough replica out of wood, and probably had enough energy to try it. Although, he refrained from doing any of that. He left his room and started heading toward his brother's room. He passed the others' rooms and knocked on their doors as he walked. His knuckles cracked 2 of the doors. His irritation leaked into his knocks. He shouted too. Somebody broke in. The noise of people stirring let him know that people had heard him. Jill appeared beside him, her large needle was already in her hand, but she was still wearing some baggy blue pajamas. She looked around and her eyes glowed faintly. She was using her skills to try and find something. Where? Who? She spoke quickly, her head still darted back and forth. Mash shook his head and responded as the others started leaving their rooms. I don't know, but someone painted something in my room. Jill glanced back toward his room, and she vanished. She might be able to see a thread or something else he had missed. His domain showed him a lot, but he couldn't see everything. Jill and Luke both had some special sight skills that let them see some things that he couldn't. Arthur burst from his door a second before Mash could knock on it. Nothing was said, but he waltzed right past Mash. What happened? His brother spoke while rubbing his eyes. He was tired, even if it didn't show much on his face. Nothing ever showed on his brother's face. One had to look at the rest of his body to know. Mash was easily able to do that with his domain, and he could see the subtle way his brother's feet dragged as he walked. His brother wasn't wearing pajamas like the others though. He was still in his uniform, and Mash guessed he must have fallen asleep in it. Mash knew that his brother had been getting a lot of extra work recently, and he kept getting more because of Mash's actions. I don't know. I was about to sleep, but I saw something weird on my ceiling. Oh, and it's not blood. As Mash tacked on the statement about the pain at the end, he realized that he hadn't warned Jill. He hadn't heard a scream or anything, so she was probably fine. It took less than a minute to get from Arthur's room to his. Red and Luke were already inside, and Mash walked in after his brother. The room was large, but it still felt a little crowded with 5 people inside. Everyone was staring at the ceiling. What is it? Luke asked Red. He spoke quietly as if he was worried about someone listening in. Mash didn't feel any magic or see anyone with his domain, so he thought that they were safe, but caution was probably the right call. Red shook her head. I don't know, but that isn't blood. She said it for Luke's sake, but Mash saw Jill relax a little too. His brother didn't say anything, but he opened his storage space and pulled out a book and pen. He began copying down the strange symbol exactly, and Mash raised an eyebrow as he did so. What's that for? His brother spoke without halting. I will get the general to look at it. She had requested me to inform you if anything happened around you in particular. Also, she might recognize it. Mash peeked at Arthur's notebook and could tell that he was struggling. As good as Arthur was at most things, he was surprisingly bad when it came to art, or music for that matter. Mash had a better solution. He held his hand out and wood formed, creating a perfect replica of the symbol. He held it over his brother's half-complete drawing. That action actually got his brother to sigh. He grabbed the wooden imitation and placed it into his storage space along with the notebook. Should we test it? I learned a little bit about enchantments and think I can activate this. No. No. Both his brother and Red spoke. She shouted and his brother had spoken icily. Mash hadn't been serious, but neither of them was having it. They just weren't in the mood for jokes. Arthur glared at Mash, before turning to Red and speaking. You 4 check the house. Luna isn't here tonight, but I will let her know what happened just in case. Well, I will make sure to tell Alex to be more careful since Luna won't listen. Mash could picture Luna's reaction. She hadn't changed much despite becoming an apostle for a god. She wouldn't change because of some weird painting. His brother left, and Mash turned to look at Jill. Any strings or whatever? Jill grumbled her response, as she continued to stare at the weird symbol. Yeah, but a lot of them. Her head danced back and forth, and she continued. They're moving too. You know what, let's just go this way. Jill just started walking in what seemed like a random direction. Nobody even questioned her though, and just followed behind. Mash kept checking his surroundings with his domain. Peeking into other rooms as he walked by. He was good at searching through a building. Doors didn't stop his domain, and he would even be able to search through small corners easily. Jill was looking slightly upward, her gaze focused on those strings that only she could see. She never tripped or stumbled and just strolled through the hallway. Mash quickly grew irritated as nothing happened. The more time that went by, the more annoyed he got. He wanted to sleep, not because he needed to sleep but just because he wanted to. The day had been long, and this would only make it feel even longer. He needed a distraction. Just following Jill around was growing old fast. They hadn't found anything and had been taking a lot of turns. Mash opened his storage space and grabbed some dried meat from within. The others didn't stop for him, but he caught up easily. The meat wasn't anything fancy, but it was sweetened heavily. It was made with sugar, which made it rather expensive. He enjoyed chewing on it, but he ate it slowly. He held some of it out for the others. Only Luke grabbed a piece. Jill was still focused on whatever she was looking at, and Red just didn't like the taste of sweetened meat. She preferred savory or spicy meat dishes. Jill turned and stopped before another room. Mash's domain let him look inside, and he could see that it was a kitchen. He walked up to the door and pressed himself against it. His domain slowly encompassed the entire room, and he saw nothing special. Nothing magical even. I think it's safe. Nothing magical. The confirmation was enough, and they walked into the room. Jill activated the lights and the room lit up quickly. The 4 didn't bother scavenging through the room. It would be pointless. Instead, they just watched as Jill walked over to one of the dishes and grabbed a plate from it. The plate was one meant for the servants and was made of wood rather than metal or clay. On the plate was a replica of the strange symbol from earlier. Just what was going on here? Chapter 263, Glyphs of Power. Mash held the plate as they followed another string to a different location. They had talked for a while about the situation, but none of them were able to place where they had seen the weird symbols before. Like the previous one, this symbol wasn't magical, nor was the plate itself. It was just a common dish. Mash tried waving it about and tried to look at it from different angles. He still didn't recognize it. The next string took them to a closet, and like the previous, Mash couldn't detect anything within. Inside they found another identical symbol painted on the floor within. It was done in the same red paint as everything else too. The closet was unremarkable, but he noticed that it was strangely empty. Where are all the cleaning stuff? Mash couldn't see any mops or brooms or anything. There were some things like soap and stuff against the racks that lined the walls. However, it seemed like anything that could be used to clean the floor was removed. Whoever placed the symbol here, clearly wanted to leave the symbol unblemished. Why though? It wasn't magical, but the clean design let him make a replica easily. They moved on after Mash made a replica of the mark out of wood. When he made the replica, he realized that it wasn't the same. The circle itself was a little larger, and thus the pattern had repeated an additional time. Was it just because of the size of the initial circle, or was it a mistake? Mash thought back to the one in his room, and it had even more repetitions than the one here. It was definitely intentional, but what did it mean? The symbols didn't feel harmful. Maybe it was a message? Do you think it's a message? Mash noticed Red's head slightly bent down in agreement. It makes the most sense, but why would someone bother with all of this? And what happened for them to do this now? Mash considered her questions and the many events of the day that could have led to this situation. Then he realized that there were a lot of possibilities. It could be for anything. The stuff with the god, or the trouble with my race, or it could even be the stuff with foreign spies. Literally any of them. Mash doubted this had to do with the foreigners. That felt too recent, and he doubted that they could have prepared something this extensive so quickly. As he thought about his day, he tried to imagine when the house had been empty. That was probably when they set it up, whoever they were. It must have happened when he had been kidnapped. There would have been servants around, but it would be easy to get around them. The real question would be how they got around the house's detection magic. Mash thought about it as they searched through the rest of the house. They ended up finding 10 more of the symbols. Some were painted on things they could move like chairs or tables, but many were just painted on the floor or wall. Once they had collected all that they could find and confirmed that no intruders remained within the building, they regrouped in Mash's room. It hadn't taken all that long to get all the symbols or copies of the ones that were on walls and floors. Any idea what to do now? I did my job. Jill spoke as they all sat around a pile of the symbols. The paint on the ceiling remained where it was, and Mash continued to try and read it. The pattern was almost recognizable. He had seen it before. After seeing the other symbols, he was certain of it. Turning his thoughts inward, he decided to sort through his memories like he had done before. Although, he didn't make it such an emotional hurdle this time, and just had Priscilla recreate any of the writing he had seen in the past. She had a perfect memory and could look through his past with the same skill. Priscilla responded by sending him a series of images. Hundreds of symbols, letters, and even drawings flashed through his mind. She worked fast and different memories passed through his mind each second. He continued to search through them but was shaken out of the trance when Luke tapped his shoulder. Mash opened his eyes to see Luke staring into them. Luke's eyes darted about as he checked Mash's condition. "Are you okay?" Luke spoke and his magic slowly flowed through Mash, as he scanned him for any injuries. Mash felt his concern but didn't understand why. "Yeah, why? You just froze up and just stopped responding. I thought something happened." Jill was sitting across from him and sounded concerned as she explained. Mash hadn't told him what he was doing, and he felt a little bad as he saw the gentle looks on all of his friends. They were all worried about him, and he had left them in the dark again. "Oh. I was just looking through my memories with Priscilla. I was Mash struggled to explain what he was doing, and he tapered off as he realized that he owed them a little more than an explanation. They probably didn't care as much for that. He took a small breath. It wasn't as relaxing as he had hoped it was. It was the same mistake he made before. He always repeated his mistakes. People always said that they learned from their mistakes. They made it sound so easy, but that was a lie. He shook his head and remembered Priscilla's words. He would do better eventually, even if it took him his entire life. Although, he would start right away. I'm sorry. I should have told you guys what I was doing. I am really sorry. The day was weighing on him. He didn't feel broken by it though. He didn't dwell on his mistakes either. He let them affect him and then moved forward. His gaze didn't drop once, and he stared forward at his friends. It's not really such a big deal, we just wanted to make sure you were good. Jill coughed awkwardly before replying. She realized that Mash had taken her words more seriously than she intended. For his part, Mash's face colored a little as he got embarrassed. Everyone just stared awkwardly for a solid minute. The silence of the moment quickly became suffocating for Mash. The one who was least bothered by the atmosphere was Red, and she broke the quiet bluntly. Mash, we wanted you to make another replica of the one on the ceiling. In fact, can you just make some replicas for all of them? Maybe we can figure something out by laying them out. Mash nodded his head rapidly. He was grabbing at the opportunity to move on. That awkward moment had meant a lot to him. He felt like a fool as the wooden replicas started growing from his arms. They didn't just come from his hands but along his entire arm. He remade every single symbol, some from his memory and others from the objects they had gathered. Before long he had made an entire set of the strange symbols. While he made them, the others cleared the room of the clutter. They pushed the piles of things to one of the corners of the rooms and laid out the wooden replicas between them. We could try and order them by size. The original size. Luke shrugged his shoulders as he offered the suggestion. Mash had made all of the replicas the same size, and he stared down at the wooden pieces. He still couldn't piece it together. Priscilla was still looking through his memories, but he didn't join her this time. Jill began rearranging the pieces as Luke had suggested, and Mash bent down and started helping her. The wood slid against the carpeted floor. He didn't care much for the luxurious carpet. It was nice to look at, but he didn't feel like it was worth it. He slid the final of the patterns into place. They had made a circle and they stood around it. Mash walked around the symbols but kept thinking he was missing something. It was like a nagging in the back of his mind. It felt important too. That was the bigger problem. He knew that it was important, but he didn't know why. With the way they were laid out now, Mash could see it like a clock. The circles were partitioned at slightly different angles as the size of the pattern increased. Red stepped into the circle, and Mash wondered what she was doing. She bent over slowly and grabbed the one with the most circles in it. She turned it, and it took a second for Mash to realize what she was doing. The largest of the symbols was a rubric, not a part of the puzzle. She lifted the piece out and moved the others so that they followed the guide. Red slowly turned the final piece to fit the pattern. None of them were worried about anything happening. There was no mana coming from the symbols, not to mention that neither he nor Jill had seen anything suspicious. The final piece slowly slid into place, and then Red was gone. Mash had been staring at her the whole time, and still didn't grasp what had happened. As soon as Red finished the pattern, and then she just disappeared. Mash's eyebrows rose, and he belatedly held out a hand to grab her. The gesture was pointless, there was nothing but the air there. Mash tried to understand what had just happened, but it felt like his mind wasn't working. She was there 1 second, and then she was just gone. There had been no magic involved. Within his domain, his vision expanded to look at Jill and Luke. Both were staring at the space in disbelief. He saw as Jill slowly shifted to look at him. What happened? I don't know. Mash started to reply before Jill had even finished. His panic was quickly drowned out as Luke stepped toward the formation. We need to go. He shouted the words but didn't leave them any time for discussion. He thrust into the circle and vanished as soon as his foot had entered the space. It was the same as Red's sudden disappearance. No mana at all? How? Mash couldn't feel anything from the pieces of wood, and his instincts weren't telling him anything either. Things weren't supposed to work like that. Jill stepped into the circle an instant later. There was no hesitation in her movements. Mash paused only for an instant. Priscilla, tell my brother everything. She gave him confirmation, but she hadn't sent any messages. She was scanning his memories, but Mash knew that she was probably already sharing the details with Arthur. Maybe she had been doing it from the start. He hoped that was the case and walked toward the strange thing. He stared at the supposedly non-magical symbols, before stepping in himself. His foot seemed to move more slowly than normal, and Mash got a better look at the symbol from up close. He loomed over it for an instant. When Red had moved them around, she had to shift the entire thing, as she had removed one of the pieces. It was only now, moments before stepping inside, did he finally remember the symbol. Chapter 264, Recognition of the Past. Mash's first instinct upon stepping into the formation was to fight. Or rather to prepare for a fight. His body reacted naturally, and his body began to change slightly before he stopped and just stared at his surroundings. There was no light. Not even a tiny speck from a star or moon. It was cold too, dangerously so, and even his blood began to freeze. Mash paused on the transformation and diverted his efforts to change his body temperature. He could control it himself, though it was normally Priscilla who adjusted for those kinds of things. His eyes were made useless at the moment. Without even a tiny speck of light, there was nothing for his eyes to see. That wasn't the worst of it. He couldn't feel anything either. There was nothing for his skin to touch, and he didn't even think that there was any air for him to breathe. There was no odor. It was just empty. No sound for his ears to pick up on. He might have panicked if not for his domain, and some help from the other skills that were steadying his mind. None of his normal senses could help him now. His domain, however, was not normal and was not limited by the same things as the others. With it, he could tell that he hadn't been teleported, and better yet he could get a sense of direction. He wasn't being teleported but moved. The space around him was being dragged behind as he propelled forward. The shifting space was odd. It didn't feel like he was moving, but his domain showed him otherwise. Mash could see himself too, and it looked like he was just hovering in place. Not standing, but it was like he had been frozen while falling. Mash looked around in awe, though he didn't do it with his eyes. The way the space around him shifted backward was fast. Faster than he could have moved. Faster than he thought was possible. He wanted desperately to know what was happening, but it was impossible for him. There was a problem though. None of the others were within his domain. Mash thought of a few possibilities for that. They were too far forward, and well out of the range of his domain. That seemed like the most likely explanation. The other would be that they were all moving in different directions. He hoped that wasn't the case. Another thought passed his mind, and he turned to Priscilla. Priscilla. I think I recognized the symbol. Check my memories of a long time ago. It was in that book. In a book I found before I met you. Mash vaguely remembered the incident in question. It had been a journal of sorts that had been tucked away and hidden. Within, he had found references to the large snake which owned that labyrinth world. The one that had left its mark on him and laughed at his fate. Mash would not forget that encounter, though he had forgotten about the book. He felt a little guilty about not thinking of it, but it had been a long time and the book wasn't very important. Although, he remembered that one of the pages had a drawing of the symbol. He was surprised by his own memory but guessed it was Priscilla's influence. I found it. Mash watched as the image flashed in his mind. The symbol was recreated almost exactly, and he saw some text written beneath it. It wasn't in a language he could recognize, and his translation item didn't seem to work with memories. Did he have the book with him? No, he remembered that he had given it to someone. His brother? He had asked about it, but Mash didn't know if he actually had it with him. Did Red take it? He remembered giving it to her once. He wanted to open his storage space to check, but he was pretty confident that it wasn't there. The book had notes on the world owner. The snake was mentioned directly, and he remembered that it had talked about others as well. Other than that, it had information on unique monsters and strange creatures too. He had enjoyed flipping through the book and just seeing crude drawings of unknown creatures. Although, he never actually read the book fully, and he didn't pay much attention to other information in it. The darkness around him was complete, but it broke eventually. 1 second, he was floating through a river of nothing, and the next he was standing on solid ground. His body had grown considerably hotter during the trip. He had needed to increase his body temperature a lot to counter the coldness. The tiled floor beneath his feet felt cold with how hot his body was. He quickly let the heat bleed away, but it was a slow process. Even for him, it was dangerous to shift it too rapidly. He needed to gradually change the temperature. It would only take a minute or so, but it was still a pain. His domain filled the space and didn't hit any walls. He did feel the others within it though. Red, Jill, and Luke were huddled together. Mash could see that Luke was healing Jill, whose skin was slightly discolored in some places. She had changed from her pajamas into a much thicker sweater. Red's pale skin was still pale, although he didn't see any signs of frostbite like on Jill. Since Luke was still healing her, then they had probably only arrived a few seconds before he did. He looked around. There was light here and an open sky to boot. Despite the floor being comprised of stone tiles, the sky was open, and he saw an orange sun in the sky. That was strange, though not as weird as the bluish-green sky that surrounded it. Mash was glad to realize that he could breathe here. The stone tiles lead in a straight path up to a series of buildings that he could barely make out in the distance. Surrounding the stone path was grass that was surprisingly well kept. It was clearly cut regularly, and he even noticed some flowers placed in obvious patterns across the plains. The flowers ranged in different shades of reds and yellows. It was all very pretty. Despite the inviting beauty, the trip wasn't very inviting. Jill's frostbite was proof enough of that. Mash walked over to the others while looking at the buildings in the distance. He couldn't really tell how big or small they were from here, but he knew that they were buildings. They were too blocky and tall to be anything else. Mash pointed towards them and spoke once he got close. "Are you okay? And do you think those are buildings?" He didn't direct his questions on anyone in particular. "Yeah, just cold buildings," Jill replied and looked in the direction that he had pointed. She frowned slightly as she squinted her eyes. "Isn't that just a mountain?" Mash looked away from the building and realized that they couldn't see as far as him. When had that happened? Which transformation had given him an improved vision? Maybe it was a product of his race change. "I don't think mountains would be that blocky. It's probably a building. It had to be a town or a walled city." His gaze kept darting around randomly. He was thoroughly confused by the situation and wanted some clue as to what had happened. The others should probably know where he had seen the symbol before. Actually, it would be a better idea to just show them. "Priscilla, show them the image from before." She could send the image to the others easily. While she did that, he explained what else had been in the book. He told them about it, but it wasn't like it helped much. The mark could have been about anything. There were a lot of different creatures in the book, and he didn't know which of them would be intelligent enough to manage this. More importantly, he couldn't think of a single reason why they would even target him. Other than the snake that had marked him, he hadn't even met with anything else in the book. All four of them turned to look at the city. The tiled stone path was clearly leading them there, but it wasn't like they needed to go. There was no guarantee of safety here, though there was no place where they could get that. Jill could easily teleport them back. If this was another world, then he could make a portal here too. Mash wanted to do that. He wanted to go to sleep. This was something he could deal with after a night of rest. Mash's eye didn't droop, and his shoulders didn't sag either. As long as the day had felt, he was still filled with adrenaline. Arthur could join them as well. "I kind of want to check it out. I mean, this whole situation is pretty weird, but also interesting, right?" Jill said the words, and as one all four of them started walking toward the city in the distance. There hadn't been some great debate or argument. Even if they were tired and irritable, they were adventurers. Their curiosity demanded that they throw some caution to the wind and explore the mysterious city. Try and find out who would bother making such an elaborate and complex setup. It couldn't even be called a trap. There had been no guarantee that they would have been able to figure it out. Whoever had painted all of those symbols must have had some other purpose. The stone walkway was smooth. Mash was able to walk barefoot easily and didn't even feel so much as a pebble. That alone would have been strange. Although the setting quickly got weirder as the grass began to change color. It had been green like normal, but it had begun to shift. When the wind picked up, the whole plain began dancing to its gentle breeze. It was then that the grass seemed to shift from dark green to a deep blue. The way the grass swayed with the wind made it seem like water. Like the ripples that could only appear on the water. The breeze wasn't cold either. Everyone kept walking, but they weren't looking forward anymore. They gazed across the plains, absorbed by the beautiful shifting grass. It didn't slow them much. The sight was nothing compared to their curiosity. To Mash's surprise, it was Red who broke their casual pace. "Can't we just teleport closer?" "Yes," Jill replied quickly. Red hadn't spoken with much excitement, but Jill's one-word response was filled with enthusiasm. In the blink of an eye, they closed the distance. The city turned from an indiscernible shadow to an incredible superstructure. Dozens of perfectly shaped buildings shot into the sky. Tall glass windows scaled the sides of the buildings, and each window was framed by short sections of smooth metal. How expensive was something like that? His brother's house had a few tall windows, and Mash had a rough idea of how much that place was worth. Every building here was layered with windows. There weren't any walls to the city either, but it was definitely a city. It was far too large and elaborate to be a town. What he had thought were walls, were in fact just a series of smaller rectangular buildings that encircled the largest ones. The tallest of the buildings rested in the center, and Mash was fairly certain its top would touch the clouds. Although, he couldn't know as the sky was barren. The city itself felt barren too. Not a sound came from the city. He had never seen a silent city before. All in all, Mash couldn't believe what he was seeing. Honestly, he wondered if this was all an illusion or a dream. He spoke aloud. He wanted to hear the others and confirm that this was real. Where? No, what in the world is all of this? Chapter 265, Marks, Cults and Levels. Mash looked around quickly, devouring the city with his eyes. He pointed upwards. The gesture alone indicated his desire to fly about. The city would probably feel even more incredible while flying. Red shook her head. Not a good idea. If there are people inside, they probably wouldn't take too kindly to us flying in like that. She was right, but Mash wasn't sure about the hostility. He didn't think they were trying to attack or trap him. The paint and symbols felt more like a test or game that someone had decided to try. It felt like something someone would do out of curiosity. He knew that the others thought as much, but he would take the extra caution and follow Red's advice. She continued to explain that they might want to sneak in. It seemed like the people here weren't prepared for their arrival, and Red believed that they should try and get some more information discreetly. No one really disagreed with the plan, and they tried their best to proceed quietly. There weren't any walls, so they were able to stroll into the city without any trouble. They walked over to the nearest building. Even the smaller buildings were made in the same design as the tall ones. Metal frames with glass windows through these barely even reached half the height of the center buildings. They walked closer to it and noticed more of the tiled roads weaving in between the buildings. The gaps between the buildings were wide enough for them to sneak in without any trouble. Although, they didn't need to sneak in. The city, at least this part of it, was empty. The grass that surrounded the town vanished upon entering the city. Although there were trees occasionally, they were clearly positioned intentionally, to provide color to the otherwise bland place. For all the expense, the buildings were somewhat plain. They were all made of a combination of silvery metal and plain glass. The streets were tiled grey stone. The only color the place had was from the occasional tree that was placed in the street. The trees were framed by small metal fences, and a mound of dirt from which the tree had sprouted. It was all very clean and exact, and it was creepy. A silent, clean, and extravagant city were not as pleasing as it sounded. It was creepy, and Mash couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. The cleanliness of the city made it hard to find places to hide. They could press themselves in between buildings, but some windows would always have a glimpse of them. Hiding feels kind of pointless. I mean, just look at all the windows. We might as well stroll in the center of the street at this point. Mash shared his thoughts with the others. Unintentionally, his words echoed. That would alert them if their presence had still gone unnoticed. He doubted it, but there was a chance. They were walking along the side of one of the buildings. They were circling the city. They wanted to scope out the center before taking any of the paths that lead inward. At least that way the people inside that one wouldn't be able to see them. However, that left them completely open to the buildings across the street, not that they could spot anyone inside. Aren't these buildings incredible? Luke brushed his hand against one of the windows while he talked. His eyes were alight with awe. Mash was feeling much the same and brushed his own fingers against the metal frame. It was cold on his fingertips. It was also smooth. It really is, isn't it? You should have seen the people who had come up with the design. A smooth voice echoed in the empty city, and it was not one of them. Mash looked away from the building and tried to find the source of the sound. His head snapped down the empty street, but no one was standing within it. He swung his head around but still didn't see anything. He wanted to track the sound, but the echoes made it hard to distinguish the origin of the voice. His own voice echoed, and this person's words sounded like they were coming from everywhere. Jill was the one to find the speaker. Mash saw her point with his domain. He needed to take a few steps forward to look down the street where she was. She was standing at the corner of the building and was looking down a path that led further inside. There was someone standing there. The man was several streets deeper into the city. Even from a distance, Mash could see him though. The man wore a strange shirt and shorts. It seemed kind of childish. The shirt was made of bright blue cloth, and the sleeves barely passed his elbows. It was plain though without any fancy designs on it. Mash could see white, human skin. His shorts hung just past his knees, which made it seem big on him. The person was probably a man though his appearance made him feel like a child. The only thing the man had that made him unique was a mask. The mask covered his entire face. There were no slits or openings. Not for seeing or speaking. Even the shape of the mask was odd. It didn't bend at all, instead, it was flat like a plate. On the front of it, Mash immediately noticed that the symbol from earlier was painted on its surface. The otherwise completely white mask had the symbol painted upon it with a bright red color. There was no mistaking this paint for blood, as the color was closer to pink than red. I do hope you've enjoyed exploring our fair city. I am so very sorry. We had not expected you to arrive so soon, and no one had been there to greet you upon your arrival. You really should have called ahead. The voice came out clearly. It didn't get muffled by the mask at all. None of them were amused by the man's attempt at humor. Mash considered himself as someone who was poor at noticing or reading the room, but this man was even more blind to it. None of them responded to the man but started walking closer. Regardless of who the man was or how he acted, the four of them started preparing for a fight. Mash didn't want to be sealed or trapped again and started transforming his body. He didn't make the changes visible though. He focused inward, using his wolf form's improved muscles to increase his stats. That was just one step. He mixed his cat form's coordination and reflexes. The wolf form already improved his reflexes a little, but it was mostly focused on physical speed. However, it was his cat form that actually made the best use of the speed. A test that he had discovered recently. Priscilla could give him a detailed analysis of what happened to his body when he transformed. It let him find some good combinations. This was one of them, although the energy cost was high for this transformation. The others would be making their own preparations, but they didn't get to approach the man in silence. He was a talker it seemed, and the man was more than happy to carry on a conversation by himself. I see you aren't much for conversation. However, that is usually the case with every newcomer. I hope you don't mind if I speak though. I find that it becomes harder to speak candidly the less distance there is between us. There was still no response. Not even Jill quipped with the man, but Mash could see her summon her needle. It coalesced in her hand, and that got the masked man to take a step backward. Wait, wait, wait. I am not here to fight you. I am merely a guide. If I had known that you would finish the first test so quickly, I would have met with you all outside of the city. The man's hands came up, both palms were open and faced toward them. A simple sign of surrender, one that would normally cause Mash to stop. The usual reaction would involve speaking to the strange man. He was tired and had already experienced the consequences of his naivety today. It was not a mistake he would make again. Well, at least not on the same day. I'm not supposed to fight with you. Would you care for a tour of the city instead? There are many things here that would certainly be interesting to you. I'm sure there is better entertainment here than a simple brawl. Especially, since I am bound to lose. I know. How about we play a game instead? We could even flip a coin. The man started talking a little faster, but Mash could tell that it was just an act. The man wasn't scared. No, he was eager, excited even for the fight. Mash could only tell because he was feeling much the same. Even before knowing anything about the man across the street, Mash could tell that he was strong. At the very least, he was confident enough to believe that he could handle all four of them at once. Once they were close enough for Mash to use his lightning magic effectively, Red finally responded to the man's chattering. Who are you? Where are we? If you really don't want to fight, we are going to need some answers. Red didn't raise her voice, but she glared at the man. Most people would assume that Mash, Luke, or Jill were the deadliest in their group, but that was wrong. Red might not fight in a flashy way, and she didn't have a special weapon and wasn't a god. However, she was arguably the best at killing. Her attacks inflicted a debilitating poison. Mash had gotten hit once or twice when they had sparred, and he still remembered how much it had hurt. It was like his insides had been burning, and there had been nothing he could do to put it out. Even if Mash could handle the damage, the pain still affected him. The man across the street tilted his head to the side. Mash got the feeling that he was looking at him. Well, that was a bit of a letdown. Either way, let me introduce myself properly. I am known as 51. You may address me as Sir 50, or Mr. 1. That was a joke, don't do that. His words were received poorly, although Mash did smile a little. Not because he thought the man was funny, but rather it was because it seemed like he wasn't trying to avoid a fight. The man still had his hands up in the air in surrender, but that didn't mean much to them. He tried speaking again, but Jill teleported next to the man. She aimed her javelin at his side and thrust it at the man. Mash grinned and dashed forward, but he thought that Jill's attack seemed like an extreme reaction. A wall of flame erupted between Jill and the masked man. It didn't hit Jill as she teleported again. However, that did prevent her attack. Mash was the next to arrive, although another wall of fire rose from the ground directly in front of him. He didn't care though and jumped through the fire. It was hotter than he expected, and his skin burned as the flames brushed against his skin. The burning flesh healed as it happened. Luke could cast his magic so long as he could see Mash, and the healing was more than enough to offset the fire. Mash swung his fist through the flames. The flames spread out from the speed of his swings, but the man was gone. Mash could see him within his domain and snapped his head to the side. An enormous ball of fire was flying towards him incredibly quickly. Even with his stats, he knew that he couldn't avoid it. Mash let his anti-magic aura billow outward, and he tried to raise his arms to brace for the impact. Chapter 266, 51 Flames. The ball of fire wasn't red but a mix of blues and oranges. It was hot enough that Mash felt his skin burning even before the spell hit him. He managed to get one arm up to block the fireball. It exploded when it hit him, and Mash felt his arm burn badly. The explosion also filled the street and blocked Luke from seeing him. The arm he had managed to raise was charred and blackened by the flames, and Mash grimaced as the pain spread from his forearm. The arm was practically useless. Not just because of the pain, but the flames had damaged his nerves. Priscilla was already trying to fix the damage, but it would be far easier to just get within Luke's line of sight. That had been some of the fastest magic he had ever seen, and that included his own lightning. He had less than a second to react once it had entered his domain. Fire magic could move that quickly. It was a fairly common thing to encounter, and he knew that most fire-based classes were about timing and preparation. Mash didn't want to take another hit like that and leaped out of the smoke toward Luke. Mash let his draconic scales start growing too. They would help him resist the flames. He broke through the smoke and saw just how much of the street had been covered by it. That might even have been the attack's primary purpose. Mash managed to get out of the smoke though, and Luke was quick to start healing him. The relief was instantaneous, and the burnt flesh quickly reconstructed itself. Once he had seen the injury, Mash realized that it wasn't as bad as it had felt. The flames had only really burned through his arm where the center of the impact had been. The rest of his arm only suffered from surface-level burns. I had heard you could heal, but I had been led to believe that you needed to kill someone to utilize it. Have you improved the skill already? The voice came from above, and Mash turned up to see the man flying in the air. Flames had coated his feet, and he appeared to just be standing in the air. Another kind of flight, it was kind of like Red's method. The man was still talking casually. He seemed to want a conversation, and Mash was inclined to give him one. The man's magic had stoked Mash's curiosity. So, he spoke casually. I've done it a few times already. Why do you care? Mash was genuinely curious, though it felt awkward to ask such a casual question in the middle of a fight. At this point, he wasn't sure how the fight would go and wanted to get the man talking. Wait, a few times? That shouldn't be possible. Have you noticed your leveling slowing at all? He spoke while evading attacks from Jill and Red. Jill teleported on top of the man and threw her weapon at him. The speed only increased as it headed downward. A wall of flames sprouted into existence above 51, but the weapon didn't slow as it passed through fire. The man with the mask must not have expected that, and the weapon slammed into his arm while he was speaking. The weapon passed through without even halting, and Mash saw that it cut a deep gash into the side of his bicep. The way the weapon worked, the part of his arm that was hit simply stopped existing. The man spiraled away from the weapon, as Jill reappeared midair and caught the weapon again. She didn't slow down and immediately threw it again. How was she teleporting so accurately to the weapon? Then he realized. She must have put a mark on it. It was proving quite effective as she threw and teleported to the weapon. She was able to consistently throw the needle at 51. The man had adapted quickly enough. He realized he couldn't block Jill's attacks and was focused on dodging instead. Although he did try and counterattack too. Although hitting Jill was hard, he couldn't manage it while also avoiding Red, who was controlling small blades of blood. Like the weapons that hovered over her back, she had spread some petals of blood which she moved to surround and trap the masked man. Even a single cut from those could prove deadly. The masked man burned many of the petals. Mash saw the man glance at him and Luke, both of whom were watching as Jill and Red left little space for them to get involved. Well, Mash couldn't jump in without getting hit by one of them. Luke was able to utilize his buffing skills and golden lines glowed on all of their bodies. The masked man did not seem to be enjoying the fight as much anymore. His attacks never landed on Jill, and rarely hit Red, both of whom were very capable of dodging. Red was able to heal quickly with her unique body constitution on top of Luke's healing. No, answer my question first. Why do you care? Mash waited for a lull in the sounds before he spoke. He knew that he should probably help, but it would be hard to join. The man with the mask glanced at Mash, his mask moved to face him. Mash got the distinct feeling that he was being glared at, and he replied by holding his hands up to indicate that it was his turn. Once you get to a high enough level, you will have to choose between progressing your skills or your levels. Most people only start doing that once they get over 200. Although there are a few rare exceptions. I am happy to include myself among those. Jill and Red had both paused as they were interested in what he was saying. All four of them stared at the man who revealed such information so freely. Did he really know what he was saying, or was he just spouting nonsense? Mash didn't know, but he didn't really care all that much either. Whether he was being told the truth or not, it sounded like 51 believed it to be. I guess that makes me an exception as well, and are we going to keep fighting? Mash had the feeling that the others weren't as hostile as before. Attacking the man hadn't been the fairest thing to do, but it served to prove his intentions. Even after getting hit by Jill, he didn't suddenly become more hostile. Nor had he been fighting seriously. He was testing their abilities and wasn't actually trying for any really dangerous attacks. Mash thought that an enemy would have fought harder if they wanted him dead. As I mentioned previously, I am simply here to greet you. A tour guide of sorts. However, I am here to serve and will engage you as long as you would like. The man returned to his usual voice, but it had broken during the fight. So, this was an intentional decision then. He purposely acted annoying. He probably wanted to provoke a fight. He still wanted to fight, didn't he? The mask was pointed at Mash, but he was descending slowly. Let's just stop. What do you want? Red spoke up, annoyed as the small petals of blood returned to her. She walked back over to the rest of the group. She never took her eyes off of 51. Jill just appeared beside Luke, though her weapon was still in her hand. Even if the fight had ended, no one had actually relaxed yet. Mash was just as confused by the situation. He still wasn't sure if they should fight or not. A single sneak attack might end the fight, though he wasn't really out for blood anymore. Honestly, they hadn't planned on killing him at all. They just planned to capture the man, but he proved a bit too strong to make that easy. It wasn't worth the hassle anymore. The masked man turned his head to Red before responding. He spread his arms out, gesturing to the city. I am here to tell you of this wonderful place and explain things to you all. So, you kidnapped us? Jill's response came out fast. Mash didn't really agree with it though, and 51 seemed to be thinking along the same lines. Mash looked at the city and was surprised to see that the streets were without damage. He would have expected that fireball earlier to have done something. At the very least, he would have expected it to scorch the streets. Nothing had taken any damage. Mash was going to ask about it, but the man started replying to Jill. Kidnap? Or rather we, did nothing of the sort. We simply gave you the tools needed to make it here. It was you who had passed the test and taken the journey. Mash was about to interject and ask about what the man had said earlier, but Luke was a second faster. Why did you give us the test? I think that's what we really want to know. Even the good-natured Luke sounded a little annoyed with the man. The words were a little biting as he cut through the attempted humor. Mash held his tongue and waited for the man's response. There was plenty he wanted to ask about, but he guessed that this was the most important thing. So, he decided to be patient for the moment. Of course, I should have let you know earlier. Your group has grown quickly, and that has not gone unnoticed by the more significant organizations. I belong to such a group. Wait, this is recruitment. Jill cut him off his explanation as she realized what was going on. A voice couldn't get much colder than her right now. If she hadn't really been trying to kill him before, Mash thought that she would now. Mash was equally irate and made himself known. Are you telling me this was all some kind of stupid recruitment plan? Could you not have done this in the morning? Mash's curiosity had been drowned out by his own annoyance. His emotions were being encouraged by the others sharing them. Everything about this situation was insane. Well, we didn't expect you to finish so fast, and we placed the puzzle when we were given the opportunity. Your house is a rather hard place to enter so freely. Luckily that stuff with the spies had drawn everyone out. The man still tried to be jovial. He continued as he did before, and completely ignored the cold response he was getting. Red was about to snap back but got cut off by the man. He held a hand up to forestall her. This will get us nowhere. Do you really not have anything else you want to ask me about? Perhaps you are interested in the way we brought you here? Or possibly what I had shared during the fight about skills and levels. I am standing here in order to act as the pleasant guide. Red still looked like she wanted to explode at the man, though her words were spoken calmly. She adjusted quickly and turned the question to something more important. As she started speaking, Mash grew far more attentive. Okay fine, what do you know about classes? The man's aura seemed to glow as he received the question. A boring question, but one I am happy to be asked. I know the knowledge you have is rather limited, so I will start at the beginning. As you advance in your class, it becomes more specialized for you. That is common knowledge, but have you ever contemplated what exactly that meant? Chapter 267, Fireball Expert. They talked for a while longer than Mash expected. When 51 had said beginning, he meant the very basics. Most of what he had said was well known by all of them. Although he had finally begun talking about something new. Although, he had constantly bragged about his own class and skills. As I mentioned previously, both skills and classes can advance. Normally, advancing one quickly would mean slowing the other, though the truly gifted can get around that. I, myself, am one of those talented few. Mash, you have made similar progress if I heard correctly. Mash didn't want to be involved in the man's braggadocio's claims and frowned. Plus, that didn't even sound right. He didn't think he was the strongest. He might be the best all-rounder but even that was uncertain. However, he wasn't really the best at anything. I'm not the strongest. Jill can pretty easily beat the rest of us. Mash's words were received with laughter, and it wasn't a masked man. Jill, Luke, and Red all chuckled dryly in response. Jill even raised her hand to her forehead and started to rub it. None of them said anything, but Mash felt like he had just been made a fool. Haha. It seems like your friends would disagree. And rightly so. I know little of your skills, but I understand that you can fight near infinitely and you can take the abilities of your enemies. You should start eating other people, by the way. Ethics and morality aside, you are foregoing a major advantage of your abilities. Red cut him off. She didn't pretend to be friendly and glared at the masked man. Her words were sharp and carried her irritation disturbingly well. Move on, we know about Mash already. Are you saying we will always be weaker than him? The masked man shook his head quickly. He had stopped antagonizing Red, as she had tried to attack him during the lecture already. She didn't miss either and her attack had bothered the man. She removed the poison quickly, but she let it hurt him for longer than was friendly. Normally, she was the most controlled of the group, but even she was reaching the limits of her patience. Of course not, most wouldn't even start to do this until 150 or even 200. Even then there are a few among the truly high-leveled that would say otherwise. They would swear that advancing one's class and level are far more valuable than skills and would pursue levels without end. I believe you have spoken with the Throne Keeper, she is one such person. She had focused on her levels and class advancements, relying on her stats to compensate for a lack of understanding of skills. Both paths can provide impressive boons, and I believe that one should simply pursue both, even if it is more tasking. Forsaking one for the other is foolishness. You all can certainly choose either path. You shouldn't try and compare us. As I said, Mash and I are rather exceptional exceptions. Well, I am even more impressive, but that is not very important, is it? The man liked the sound of his own voice, and he rambled with his explanation. He had been doing that the whole time, and it was grating. Mash remembered Daniel and couldn't help but compare this man to him. Daniel had been so friendly and hadn't been condescending at all. Condescending was the perfect word to use to describe 51. He was an incredible resource for information, and Mash forced his words out. What makes you so exceptional? Mash laced the last word with sarcasm, but he still gritted his teeth as he said it. It was hard to give the man even the smallest amount of credit. However, Mash resolved himself to ask the question. His curiosity overpowered his distaste. Mash thought that the man was smiling and felt a shiver run through his spine. Since you asked, I am obliged to answer. You see, I was one of the youngest recruits. I started advancing my skills from my very first advancement. How many years ago was that now? Well, it doesn't really matter. My very first skill was a basic fireball skill. It was that skill that I had loved more than any other. Naturally, I had used little else. The skill represented my dreams, and I had gotten it on my first try. Even now I can remember the day. The man's head turned upward slightly. He seemed to be enjoying his recollection, and that was when Jill decided to ruin his moment. And Mash winced at the tone. They were all lacking sleep, and Jill let her irritation show. 51 turned his gaze back slowly and sadly but began speaking again. Yes, of course. My first class advancement was Fireball Expert and my skill already upgraded to Unique when I got it. I suspect you have all received at least one unique skill. In comparison, I have 4. I believe you can understand the significance of that. That got Mash's attention. Mash only had a single unique skill, and it was incredibly useful, even if it wasn't meant for direct combat. Jill or Red's unique ability was much more suited for combat, and both were extremely potent. He could only imagine what having 4 unique skills was like. It was hard to stay hostile. His childish curiosity burned within him, and he asked a question that most would not. What's your class? Maybe he should have asked about his level, but this felt like a more appropriate question. He couldn't maintain the same coldness as the others but didn't really care. The masked man turned to look at him. He didn't seem as bothered by the question, and Mash spoke easily. A class for a class then. Chimeric Vagabond. Mash didn't even hesitate to respond. He knew that most would keep their class a secret and a heavily guarded one, but he would give it away for this. The grin on his face was wide and childish, but he just stared at the masked man. That was a little unexpected. I gave my word though. I cannot give you my full class name as it would give up a little too much information. However, I'm certain that what I give you will be more than equivalent to a level 100 class. My class is Fire Lord of the Fireball. He paused after saying it. Everyone was giving him an incredulous stare, unable to believe what had just been spoken. That might be the most ridiculous class name that Mash had ever heard. Jill looked suspicious, and Red somehow managed to glare more deeply. I know what it sounds like, but Oops, almost said something I shouldn't. Just know that what I spoke is the truth. That is the name of my class. None of them protested or spoke against it. They continued to stare at him, trying to figure out what he had been about to say. The conversation died, and even 51 couldn't salvage it. He tried adding a word or two to entice them, but they were too focused on the words that had been unsaid. The masked man turned and began walking further into the city. Much to my disappointment, this conversation appears to have ended. Nothing more to say here anyway. Let us delve deeper into the city, so that we may begin your next test. It wasn't his words but his movement that brought them out of their thoughts. They couldn't figure out what he had intended to say and focused on what he had just said. A question popped into his mind, although someone else asked it. Another test? What's it going to be and what is the point? You have an idea of what we can do now? The masked man nodded, but he didn't slow. We need to make sure that you have potential. The test will be about more than just pure combat, and I expect many of you to fail. That was all he said. His earlier exuberance seemed to have vanished as the discussion moved away from him. He liked to talk about himself, to brag about his skills and abilities. That didn't extend to his organization or this so-called test that they needed to take. What if we don't want to join? Also, what is your organization? The question probably should have been asked earlier, but he hadn't bothered with something so obvious. He expected to 51 to answer that without being asked, but it must have slipped his mind. This organization should choose better guides. He couldn't imagine many people would be particularly tolerant of the man. Honestly, even they had been at the edges of their patience. Mash was tempted to smack the man but that probably wouldn't work. 51 was strong, stronger than any of them even if his abilities were limited. The man in question sighed audibly before answering. Yes, I should have mentioned this earlier. You are free to leave whenever you like. I assume you have several ways to return on your own. As for my organization, we are known as the followers of the compass. Now let me pose a question to you before continuing. Do you know that each world has an owner? One who can shape and change the very foundations of the entire world. Mash's expression stayed neutral thanks to Priscilla's quick thinking. She had helped him control the muscles in his face and restrain himself from giving anything away. Red's expression was unchanging as always, though Luke and Jill both gave away the truth. Neither of them had any special ways to control their expression and relied on their self-control. They weren't good enough to escape the man's notice though. Well now, that is interesting. I would love to find out how you found out about such things, but I will leave that matter alone for the moment. I expect none of you would be willing to share such a secret with a stranger. Instead, let me speak about my organization. We support the current world owner. Many of our members have received his blessing as well. As 51 said that he tapped the front of his mask indicating the symbol. Mash made the connection and realized why the mark had been included in the book. Whoever had written the book had known of his world's owner. Or was this a different world? Wait, is this the same as our world, and who is the world owner? Mash didn't know if he would receive a straight answer or any answer for that matter. He still asked as the person in front of him had been open. The masked man still didn't turn and kept walking forward. He didn't speak, and Mash looked around as they passed the shorter buildings. Now they were walking into a different section of the city. Mash stared up and around at the buildings. These buildings were grand constructions. Each was taller than the biggest castle he had seen, and they seemed to reach toward the sky. They had signs of life in them too. Not many, but he noticed that some of the windows had shutters or curtains that were closed. Many were still open, but these were the first signs of life that he had seen. The city itself was still quiet though, and the streets were very empty. As 51 continued to walk, Mash realized where they were headed. He was taking them to the central building, the one that stood taller than the rest. 51 started speaking again. Yes, it is, this is the original world. The one you live in is but one of the previous owner's creations. The ruler of our world, the one whom we follow, is known as the Pioneer of Echoes. Chapter 268, Test for Knowledge. The Pioneer had changed the class system, made it so that our people could surpass others. Not just the monsters that had come to our world, but the invaders as well. You have seen firsthand the power of some of those other worlds. Those demons almost destroyed a city. The demons' world is large, and what you had fought amounted to little more than a scouting party. 51 sounded proud of his organization, but at the same time his praise this time felt a little flat compared to his braggadocio's claims earlier. Mash ignored all of that and asked the question that had pushed aside everything else in his mind. Changed? Then who created the class system? Oh, you finally asked something I simply cannot answer for you. I am sorry for the inconvenience, but even I have rules that I need to follow. Either way, we are out of time. Mash was a little annoyed by the response but was distracted by the building that was in front of him. It was a street or two away, but he was close enough now to get a good look at the enormous structure. He had known it was tall. That much had been obvious even at a distance. What he didn't realize was how wide it was going to be. The base of the building could easily have encompassed a village in itself. Maybe not a large village, but that was still ridiculous. Not to mention it was still an expensive combination of smooth metal and glass. He didn't see a speck of stone, wood, or even paint on the outside. It was simply made of a silvery metal and clear glass. How many people could live here? Luke spoke aloud, although he was surprised by his own question. Luke wasn't looking for a real answer, and none had one to give. Mash shrugged his shoulders. He wouldn't even know where to start with an answer to that question. This building alone could house thousands of people. An entire city could fit in here and there would still be more space for others. They approached the building, and Mash's gaze drifted down to the set of doors that were in front of him. The doors were entirely made of glass but had metal hinges and handles. The door actually had 3 handles on each door, each located at a different height. That was strange on its own, but it was 51's next words that really surprised him. What, live here? No one lives in this building. It serves as a testing and training area for members such as myself. Admittingly, there are rooms to live nearer to the top. You can only live there after proving yourself though. I live there, by the way. Please enter and take the test. Whether you succeed or fail, it should prove educational if you have even a modicum of insight. That was a backhanded way of phrasing that. Jill snapped back, but he didn't pay any attention to her as 51 opened the door. The inside of the building left them all speechless. The separation layers of windows each represented a floor of the building. The bottom floor was a large empty space, but the ground was made entirely of the smooth metal that had been used for the building's walls. It was silvery and reflected the lights in a slightly bothersome manner. The lights themselves were rather beautiful though. They were embedded into the ceiling into some kind of dome, and a bright white radiated from them filling the dome completely. The lights were enough to make the whole room visible, and Mash realized that this couldn't be all there was. This room was bigger on the outside. Significantly bigger, and Mash could barely make out some indentations at one end of the room. Those were probably doors, though he couldn't see any handles on them. Only after taking in the whole building, did he notice that 2 more people were in the room. Mash looked at them carefully. Neither was wearing a mask like 51, and Mash could tell that they were foreigners. He didn't know from which region, but their strange hair and skin color gave away their identities. Although for one of them it was their height that revealed their origins. One had copper-brown skin and narrow eyes, that made it hard to see the man's uniquely orange eyes. Mash wasn't the greatest at geography, but he believed that those features belonged to those who lived on the southern continent. He wore clothes that matched the image Mash had in his mind too. He wore white clothing that seemed too large, and it billowed out from his body. There were no designs, or anything fancy on the clothing either. However, Mash could feel the mana on them with his domain. They were definitely enchanted. The man was more pretty than handsome, and he had long black hair that was tied into a ponytail too. The other person was notable because of his height. He was tall, probably around 10 feet by Mash's estimation. He had grey skin and long slender limbs. All of that told Mash that he was from the distant north. The Mountain Kingdom was probably this man's home. They were a reasonably isolated kingdom, and Mash had never seen someone from there before. The man had muscle, but his body didn't bulge in any significant way. He could almost be misconstrued as skinny with how his clothes hung on his body. Unlike the other man, this person's clothes weren't designed to be loose, they were just far too big for him. Did he lose weight or something? Other than his discolored skin and height, he looked otherwise human. And other than his big nose, he seemed very normal. Neither of them had a mask like 51, and Mash could see no symbol on them. It took only a second for him to make the connection. These were other recruits. It seemed like the recruitment method wasn't limited to just his kingdom, which made a lot of sense. There would be plenty of people growing quickly if the dungeons had appeared all over the world. There was no chance that his group was the only one to be approached in such an way. As if to confirm his thoughts, 51 spoke again. We are still waiting on one more, but they seem to be rather stuck with the given puzzle. You 6 will just be given the test now if you are all prepared. Mash nodded, and so did most of the people in the room. All but the northerner, who decided to make his opinion known another way. Then why did I have to wait for those 4? The man's voice was rough and deep, although he also didn't look that much older than Mash. He was probably annoyed at the situation, and Mash couldn't blame him for that. Anyone who had to deal with 51 would be at the edge of patience. They had simply arrived ahead of schedule, so I believed it would be easier to grab them and avoid needing to make the same explanations multiple times. Normally, they would only arrive after your test had ended, but we were operating under specific time constraints. If you feel inconvenienced or disappointed, you are free to leave. That was all 51 had said on the matter, and Mash got the feeling that he didn't like the northerner very much. There was little hostility in his voice as he finished speaking. The northerner just frowned and nodded begrudgingly. 51 walked across the room and past the 2 men. He stopped at a door and touched it with his hand. The door slid sideways. Mash didn't feel any mana, which meant that the door was operated by something else. Who could make something like this? He tried to think about which nation could produce something of this scale but didn't think that there were any. 51 walked into the room, and the 2 who had been standing near the door quickly followed him inside. Mash and his friends did the same, though they carefully examined the room before entering. The room wasn't anything special though. It was a large semicircular room. There was a hallway around the outside of the circle, and Mash noticed several more doors along the walkway. The center of the circle was on a lower level though and had a dirt floor rather than the metal one of the hallways. It was an arena and was similar to the one Mash had fought in before. If you expect me to fight with strangers, I will not. This came from the copper-skinned man, who was looking around with upturned eyes. His gaze dismissed the room and everyone in it as if it was nothing impressive. It was surprisingly easy to track the movement of his eyes despite how narrow they were. The man didn't want to fight, but Mash already had a different opinion. That dismissive glance had not just been at the lackluster training area. It was directed at every person in the room, him included, and Mash's patience was already at its limit. He was fairly confident he could beat the man. His domain gives him a good idea of just how strong the man was. He could even see more than just mana now. No, you will not need to fight each other unless you wish to. As for the test itself, I will begin my explanation now. You 6 will be required to either level or upgrade a skill. There are several pieces of information as well as items I am allowed to grant you, although you must ask for them specifically. You will have 1 day to accomplish this task. He raised one hand and opened his palm toward the space on the ground. If you wish to test something destructive, I ask that you do it within the arena. There are several powerful protections in place to avoid external damage. Any questions? No? Good. You may begin. Everyone just stared at 51 with disbelief, but Mash was the first to speak. He already knew what to ask for. Do you have monster corpses? I want them, and unique ones at that. Oh, and tell me what their abilities were. Mash didn't need to plan out that wish. He knew what he wanted. It was something he had thought about a lot. It was why they had gone to the Frostlands in the north. Now that he thought about it, if they had gone a little further, they would have seen the Mountain Kingdom. That got him to glance at the grey-skinned man, though he kept his thoughts to himself. No, I have a few prepared, though I will not be giving to them you like that. I expect some rationale for the items you request. And before any of you try and ask for something new, I will give you nothing for the next hour at the very least. It was a little disappointing to hear, but Mash hadn't really been expecting it to work. That would have been too easy. He would try again after an hour. He was fairly certain that he could upgrade a skill if he had a powerful enough monster to devour. Other thoughts started filling his mind. How are we supposed to level without killing someone? Red was the one to speak. That startled Mash a little, and he realized that everyone was listening to that question. Classes do not level purely through killing. Chapter 269, Alternative Methods. The first thing Mash and his friends did for the test was sleep. 51 had provided them with rather luxurious bedrolls. They were made of some fine animal fur that was very warm. All 4 of them had bedrolls already, and Mash's was quite nice too. They still asked for some though, curious to test what 51 was willing to do. The other 2 had found it odd when the 4 of them had slept, but they needed it. Mash couldn't sleep for long though and woke up after only 2.5 hours. It was good enough for him. His body didn't really need much sleep anymore. Instead, it was like a habit. Something he thought he needed, but his body didn't require it anymore. He got and made exaggerated stretches as he noticed that all of the awake people were looking at him. Even 51 was there, and he walked over casually as Mash went through his morning routine. It didn't involve much, but he opened his storage space and grabbed some snacks. Looks like you remembered your breakfast. I had some food prepared if you would like to try something new. Mash's mouth was full of some sweet fruit. It was small and red. His sister had handed him a bag of them, insisting that he would like it. He had liked them and had begun eating them whenever he was bored. He nodded to 51 while his cheeks were puffed with the delicious fruit. He didn't try to speak but watched as 51 brought out some tables. He then proceeded to set up a lavish meal. Many different stews and other dishes were set out. It was only when he set out more than one empty plate, that Mash realized this spread wasn't just for him. Although it couldn't be for his friends either. They were all still sleeping soundly. 51 waved at the 2 foreigners and invited them to partake as well. It was an extremely awkward meal. 51 talked a lot, although he didn't mention anything important. Rather he talked about the food, which was admittedly very good. Mash ate his fill in the silence, and so did the 2 foreigners. The sound of 51 speaking had quickly been delegated to the background. Some of the stews were sweet and others were spicy. Some were served with pasta while others had bread or another type of grain he hadn't seen before. All of it was tasty, and he made sure to try a little bit of everything. The awkward breakfast ended quickly. Then they all went their separate ways and began training. Mash didn't immediately do anything but instead moved around until he found a good spot. Since the arena was very open, he could easily see what the other 2 were doing. The tall grey-skinned man was sitting and meditating by the looks of it. The other man had drawn a great sword and was swinging it about idly. It seemed a little light for a great sword, though it was hard to tell without understanding how a person's attributes were skewed. With leveling and free stats, it was hard to discern a person's abilities from their appearance alone. Even his domain wasn't the best at specific understanding. It would let him get an idea of their total mana and health, which is what he used to estimate their other abilities. That was a bit short-sighted though. There were a countless number of skills that existed, and there would certainly be some that got around his domain. It seemed like neither of them knew what they were doing and were still thinking about what 51 had said. He was doing a lot of the same. 51's little hint earlier had implied that he could level without fighting. Mash knew some classes could do that, his sister had one. Although he didn't think that applied to every class. Mash thought that the classes based on healing and stuff like that could level by healing. He was reconsidering it now. He started with what he knew and tried to work backward. Classes could level without killing, but not healing classes which leveled by simply healing. Luke hadn't leveled from it, although it might be hard to accomplish at his level. His sister didn't level quickly, especially if he compared her to Arthur or himself. Leveling without killing was slow. Too slow for someone at Luke's level. Even his sister only leveled once or twice a month at best, although she was leveling a bit faster now too. His mind shifted to his own class, and he tried to remember what the class's description had been when he first got it. Priscilla recited it perfectly. A traveler to other lands, you crave the exploration before all else. Nothing can deter you. As a vagabond, you had no warnings and bow to no powers. A single world can have no hold on you, so you seek power beyond it. Engage with beings outside of it. You take the strength from forbidden creatures, giving up that which made you human. You are not human, a monster, or anything else. You belong to nothing and are bound by nothing. Thanks. Mash sent Priscilla the reply quickly and thought about what Priscilla had sent. It sounded like the nature of his class was based on exploration. Although he imagined it would take a lot of traveling to level. The other part of his class was about resisting external influences. If that was the case, would he level by rejecting enough things? That would be kind of silly. An image of him going around and just rejecting offers popped into his mind, but he ignored it. That would be stupid, and it probably wouldn't work. He was thinking in circles and decided to break out of the loop. The two foreigners looked bored to him, and Mash debated approaching them. Ultimately, he decided to approach the taller northerner. The other man's resting face was a haughty sneer, and Mash didn't want to start a fight for no reason. The grey-skinned man was meditating still, but he opened his eyes and turned toward Mash as he approached. Mash gave him a friendly smile but introduced himself normally. He felt like smiling would be a little weird in this situation. Hello, my name is Mash. Mash wasn't sure if he would get a reply. Neither of the two people had seemed particularly friendly. Thus, he was a little surprised when the seated man did reply. He smiled a little too. I am Timur. How is it that we are speaking? The question was surprising, and it took Mash a second to realize what he meant. They were speaking different languages. The translation item was always active in Mash's case, and he had just gotten used to it. Oh, I got a translation thing. Mash just left it at that. He didn't want to go into the details and explain about his tattoos and items. He just gave a simple answer and received a nod in return. Makes sense. It was a short response, but Mash didn't think that the man was trying to be unfriendly or anything. He just seemed to prefer short responses. Mash just went with it and just asked the man directly. Do you have any ideas about what to do? Timur shrugged his shoulders. No, but have upgraded a skill before. Talking with Timur was a little awkward. It felt like Mash needed to fill in the gaps himself. It wasn't too difficult though. Timur was trying to upgrade a skill since he had done it before. That made some sense. Mash nodded and told him about what he was thinking. About how healers leveled and stuff like that. They talked a little bit more, and Mash was surprised to hear why Timur was meditating. I knew about skill upgrades. My home knows. General skills are easier. Meditation is my general skill. Thanks. That makes sense. When I upgraded my skill, I did it with force and a lot of pain. Mash explained his own experience with upgrading a skill. He shared a little about what he had felt at the time. That was the end of the conversation. Both had shared their thoughts. It was an exchange of information. Two people aiding one another as they faced the same struggle. It wasn't meant to form a long-lasting friendship, but it was enough for both of them. That was all it was, and the two parted ways after some goodbyes. He walked back to his own little section of the arena and sat down. He thought about his skills and which of them were general, as Timur had put it. Hunt was a fairly general skill, though he wanted it to become more general if anything. He wondered if he could evolve the skill. Could it give him infinite energy? Was there a way to upgrade the skill to let him do that? He wanted to try, but the risk of breaking that skill was bad. If he damaged the skill, then his whole combat style would need to change. Leaving that skill as it was at the moment, he moved on to another. Thunderwood creation was another general skill. Creation skills were in their nature general, and he wondered how he could even upgrade them. Did creation skills even have upgrades? The material created could improve, but was that really a skill improvement? He might be able to upgrade the skill though, and the risk didn't feel all that extreme. Even without a specific skill for it, he could do it with his affinity and some help from Priscilla. Just like lightning or another element, he could make wooden creations the same way. He found that the skill just made the process easier and more efficient. He didn't immediately start working on the skill and thought about the other skills that he had. His golden body skill could be upgraded with enough powerful monster corpses. He still had a few wolves he could use too. Although, he had already tried that, and he knew that he would get diminishing returns if he used the same monster. Eventually, it just wouldn't work either. That did give him an idea though. His adaptable monster core was another skill that he knew how to upgrade. He had enough corpses too and could probably upgrade a few times if he wanted to. That would be painful though, and he would need to wake up Luke for it. Luke could heal his core if it was damaged. He could do that once Luke was awake. Of his remaining skills, there was only one another that he thought might work. His wooden body skill was also very general, and he already thought that he was close to an upgrade for it. When he made his duplicates, he felt like he could have gone further. He might have been able to upgrade it before but was a little afraid of damaging the skill. That was why he hesitated before, but he reconsidered it now. If that skill broke, it would affect his fighting style significantly, but he wouldn't actually become that much weaker. His transformations were stronger than his wooden creations. Only his imitation skill was really effective now. His normal wooden creations were really only good for eating and trapping things. He didn't immediately make the choice. He talked it over with Priscilla and continued to think about it for a long while afterward. Focused on that singular though, he barely even noticed when the others woke up. Red woke up first and walked over slowly. They talked a little, and Mash shared what he had learned. Luke and Jill woke up around the same time, and Mash repeated his findings again. They talked about their skills silently. Priscilla acted as a medium for them to transfer silent messages between each other. They didn't want to reveal anything about their skills to the others. Chapter 270, Grades. Mash decided to work on his skills first. His core was something that he could upgrade whenever he wanted to. There was a straightforward method for that, and he was fairly certain he could manage it later. It felt a little like cheating though, so he decided to focus on something else. His wooden creations were lagging behind compared to his other abilities. They just didn't have the power needed to fight at his level. It was useful when he was fighting lower-leveled monsters, but it didn't do much when fighting adequate opponents. The only use he had for it now was to channel lightning through. The aptly named Thunderwood was good for his lightning magic, but he couldn't channel anything else through it. It was a good place to start, and he had an expert at magic to work with. Can we just mix all of my affinities into the wood when I make it? Like I did for those duplicates earlier. He made it sound like an easy task but already knew that it wasn't. If it was that easy, she would have suggested it before. It is not that simple. Some of your affinities are incompatible and others I have not tested. I suggest you separate yourself from the others before testing. Priscilla knew that she couldn't stop him. He was determined to try and improve the skill, and the best method in his mind was forcing it to some extent. It would be a good test for the limits of the wood, plus it would probably be fun. Although, he took her advice into consideration and glanced around. He had his own little section of the arena, but he was still somewhat close to his friends. He had gone a bit further away from the other two but was still only 20 or 30 feet from Luke. There was plenty of unused space in the arena, and he walked toward the back wall. It was far enough away that he felt comfortable testing his magic. Jill also went to one corner of the room as anything to do with space magic could prove quite destructive. Mash even noticed that 51 watched her more closely than the rest. The ground in the arena was made of plain dirt. It was plain compared to the rest of the building, but there was something comfortable about solid dirt. It just felt familiar and made him feel like he was freer to destroy the ground. Mash's first thought was about trying to figure out what affinities mixed and what didn't. Priscilla, which affinities are incompatible? This was the first thing he wanted to test. Her earlier warning made him curious, and he was excited to test it. Lightning and fire are not compatible. Mash paused at her statement. He had a fire affinity. He thought about the creatures he had eaten and remembered that there had been a few that had fire-like attacks. It might be a good idea to make a list, but that would be pointless with Priscilla around. She could always tell him if he ever wanted it. It was something worth testing. The question now was how to combine the affinities. He thought about his duplicates, and what he had done at that time. Priscilla could make outlines for his magic, but he didn't need them. For him, magic was a matter of imagination, and he had become quite adept at picturing what he wanted. He wanted to mix the two immediately but had to visualize it first. What did fire mixed with lightning even look like? He considered it and found that he had no answer. Red lightning, blue fire? No, neither thing was really mixing fire and lighting. If the color was the only result of mixing magic, then nobody would bother. There was more to it than that, but what was it? He tried to imagine how his lightning magic bounced around his fingers and body when he used it. Then he just made it happen on his right hand. He watched the faintly blue streaks of light flash between his fingers. They happened randomly and instantly, and it stung his fingers slightly. Mash didn't notice the slight pricks when in a fight, but he could feel it now that there were no distractions. The next thing he did was form a flame in his other hand. He had Priscilla help him get started. He could do it on his own, but it was easier to let Priscilla do it and then replicate it later. A flame formed in the palm of his hand. It spread until his whole hand was covered in flame. It swayed slightly as he moved his hand. It was hot, and Mash could tell that it was hurting him. It wasn't burning his skin, but it was slowly heating it up. You know fire magic as well? That wasn't on the list. Mash jumped a little as 51's voice came from the flame in Mash's hand. That alone would have been an incredibly uncomfortable feeling, but that was just a small part of it. The flame grew out of Mash's control, and a part of it broke off and fell to the ground. It kept growing and started shaping itself to match a human body. A second later, 51 stepped from the flame as it shaped to form his body. It was a fascinating and disturbing sight. The man had easily taken control of Mash's magic. Plus, Mash hadn't even noticed. It just happened. He never even had the opportunity to resist either. One of his unique skills? It didn't really matter, and more importantly, Mash didn't want to deal with the man anymore. His excitement at testing his magic was being ruined by 51's presence. The logical answer was to ignore the man and just continue with what he had in mind. Mash stared at the flames that were still on his hand. The lightning was in the other. Before doing anything incredibly stupid, he partially changed to his dragon form. Scales formed over his body. They would protect him from the worst. He was confident in their magical resistance. Then he clapped his hands together. 51 was still nearby and was talking excitedly about fire magic. Mash ignored him and made sure to smack his hands together as loudly as possible. He hoped for an explosion but was rewarded with nothing. The lightning and fire spread a little bit, but it wasn't the bang he hoped for. He stared at his hands, both seemed entirely the same as before. One was still coated in flames and the other buzzed with lightning. That was rather anticlimactic. Was something supposed to happen? That isn't mixing anything. You just pushed things together. Priscilla's information would have been more useful a couple of seconds ago. He had already made a small fool of himself. Instead of responding, he just glared at 51 but made sure to direct inward too. He ignored both responses but rethought his method. Mixing his affinities wasn't just smashing them together. What was lightning? It was something that only appeared in storms. He knew it had something to do with energy. It flashed between objects. Even when he didn't aim it. It just got drawn to whatever was closest. The fire was different. He actually knew more about it, despite not really using the affinity much. It was about heat and air. It required fuel, and the air could provide that fuel. It was something that was in the air that reacted with fire starters, he knew that much. When made by magic, the mana or energy was needed to start the fire. That was similar to lightning and all magic. Unlike lightning, fire was attracted to anything. It scoured everything that it could, burning all that was around it. Fire's nature was spread and consumption, but lightning was about motion. It was a transfer of energy. An instantaneous eruption of heat and light as the energy moved. The question now was how to mix the two. Could he make a fire that moved with the speed of lightning? Or maybe it was possible to make lightning that clung to and consumed the things it struck. How would that even look? He tried to imagine it. He stared at the two magics in his hand and tried to figure out how they would look mixed properly. An idea popped into his mind, and he crossed his eyes. The fire and lightning on each hand met in the middle. He saw a fire that sprouted strands of lightning instead of embers. The center of the flames thrummed as strands of lightning bounced between his fingers. That seemed like a workable image. Mash's expression changed, and he grinned despite 51 continuing to mutter beside him. With the image set, he tried to form his mana to make it. The lightning and fire came out together, and for a brief moment, he thought that it would work. Priscilla's words echoed in his mind. These two magics were incompatible according to her. It wasn't a matter of complexity or control. They simply weren't meant to mix. He still tried it though. As the lightning and fire started appearing on his hand, he felt his whole arm vibrate. Pain spread from his palm and crawled up his arm. It stretched onto his shoulder, and only then did the magic in his hand explode. It was loud, the sound of thunder echoing in the room as both he and 51 were carried off their feet and sent flying. Mash flew almost 10 feet before landing on his back and skidding across the dirt. 51 reacted a bit better and managed to adjust his flight with fire. He landed on his feet and only skidded on the dirt for a few moments. The explosion had been hot too, and his face felt hot. Even the scales weren't enough to stop the heat, and Mash did not enjoy the feeling. Lightning and fire were not meant to mix. It was good to know, but also a little disappointing. He really thought that he might have discovered something new there. The fact that it didn't work didn't put him down though. It gave him an idea of how to mix his wood with his other affinities. He rose to his feet quickly, brushing off some of the dirt while 51 complained beside him. You really couldn't have given me even the slightest of warnings? I mean, who just explodes in front of someone? Mash continued to ignore the voice, but his explosion had drawn people's attention. Mash felt some eyes on his back, and he turned slightly. Luke was giving him a questioning look, and Mash waved him off. He wasn't hurt and didn't need any healing. He knew how to mix his magic, now it was just a matter of testing and time. Although, he didn't know how to make it affect his skill. It was one thing to simply do something with magic, and another to make it into a real skill. Still, he had a path now. A different yet familiar explosion brought him out of his thoughts. The world seemed to ripple for a second. His body warped along with the rest of the space, and Mash saw 51 look genuinely alarmed. Mash saw the man's head dart back and forth, as he examined the room and everyone in it. He had obviously been neglecting his duties to bother Mash and had no idea about what had happened. Only Mash knew, and he turned toward Jill, who was grinning wildly. Her javelin rested in her right hand and an impressive crater had formed in front of her. The dirt didn't get pushed to the side but was just gone. Erased as if it had never existed. Then she turned and spoke with a smile on her face. I did it.